Okay, so with the black pieces, we're going to stick more with a Pirc and modern slash King's Indian type of repertoire, which means that often we're going to be fianchettoing our bishop whenever we can to the G6 and bishop G7, and sometimes we will develop our knight to the F6 square. So this is the start of what we call the Pirc defense after D6 and knight to F6. As we progress up higher into the ranks, you'll find that I suggest playing the move pawn to G6 a little bit more, but while we're starting out, it's perfectly fine to just attack the center right away with the move knight to F6. This way we also are able to keep a pretty consistent repertoire as black, and we get into some very common structures. So here as black, we're attacking this pawn on e4, and white should respond by defending this pawn and developing a piece at the same time, and that is what white does. So we continue with the move pawn to g6 here. So when you're playing an opening like the Pirc or modern or King's Indian, essentially you're giving white the center at the start of the game, which is one of the most important aspects in chess. But later on, we're going to challenge the center and try to fight back for some space, because we can't just allow our opponent to put pawns in the center unchallenged. Now we're going to fianchetto our bishop, and we're going to castle our king to the king side, which is what black will do almost every single time. So there's not too much thinking involved at the very start of the game anyways. Now bishop c4 is often a very good move in, let's say, e4, e5 type of positions, but often in, let's say, the Pirc or other openings such as the Sicilian defense, this bishop can run into some tactics later on, as we'll see. A very common tactic is sacrificing this knight on the e4 square, allowing white to capture it back, and then hitting in the center with the move pawn to d5, essentially forking white's pieces. Now, we can capture right away, but I'm going to castle first to get the king to safety. Now, if white allows us to, which has happened now, to take here on e4, often the case it's good to do so. For example, after the move knight takes e4, we sacrifice the knight essentially, but we will win it back by forking the two pieces with the move pawn to d5, and we'll get rid of one important pawn in the center, which was the e4 pawn from white. And if white gives up the bishop, then we'll also get the bishop pair, which is very, very good for us. So in a way, black is fighting for the center by getting rid of one of white's central pawns, and also opening up the position for our queen and also our bishop now on this diagonal. Now white should have dropped the bishop back to try and hang on to the material, but now after knight to g5 we can safely capture this bishop. And now the issue for white is that if white's unable to recapture this pawn on c4, then white will just be a pawn down. And also, you want to try and maintain your bishop pair, like I said. So out of the two pieces, you'd rather, give up the knight rather than the bishop in most cases. Yeah, so I think white should have just taken this pawn as well if he was going to give up the bishop, because that way he wouldn't be material down. Now, since I'm up material, I'm happy to trade pawns here. Also, because I have the double pawns, I want to undouble my pawns. And I have this fantastic bishop on this diagonal, and I just want to continue to develop my pieces here. So our opponent has moved the bishop to f4, essentially giving us another pawn on c2 to capture. Now opponent's sacrificing a lot of material in this position, so I think we should just capture the material, because that's just a free pawn. Also we have this pawn on b2 which we could possibly capture as well. I'll just take that. Of course we don't need to take it because we're up a lot of material, but there's essentially no reason why we shouldn't. Now, when you're developing your pieces, because we still have a few pieces left to develop, try to develop them with tempo to squares where they attack your opponent's pieces or pawns, or they come out basically with tempo. So here the move bishop to f5 attacks the queen and develops your pieces a lot quicker. Also it sets up a nasty trap which our opponent can fall into, because this knight, as you see, is very short on squares, and it can potentially get trapped on g5 if white is not careful. Now the queen's being attacked, so white should move the queen somewhere, either to b3 or capture the pawn on c7. In either case, I think we will play the move pawn to h6 and trap this knight. So let's see what white has in mind in this position, but I think he should move the queen. Yeah, so in this position, white has miscalculated, and this is very often the case at sort of sub 1000 level, as I mentioned, that it's simply either white didn't see the threat of the bishop capturing the queen, or white has miscalculated that after rook to d1 and after bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, that I actually can recapture this queen with the rook and end up a piece up. So after this recapture, black is a piece up. So especially at this level, if you're really struggling, say sub 1000 level, to progress up the ranks, most of the time it comes down to just calculating and just looking at your captures really. Often one person has missed sort of a capture, or in their calculation they've sort of miscounted how many attackers and defenders they have on certain pieces, and this is what's leading to usually the loss of material. In this position, because we're up a rook now, we can happily exchange off a pair of rooks with the move rook to d1. And rook takes, we can just go bishop takes in this position. Also, white sacrificed way too much material this game, so unnecessary. So when you're sacrificing material, usually you want something for it. You want some sort of balance in the position. So if you're giving up material, then you want something such as a lead in development, or maybe better pawn structure, or maybe king safety, but you don't want to give up material essentially for nothing. Okay, I'll develop my knight to c6. And now we just want to trade pieces. So as many pieces as you can, trade it off the board is perfect. We could have also taken this pawn on b2, which would have also been fine, but we're already up a lot of material. So this goes for every level, but especially at this level, the more threats you can set up in the position, the more likely that your opponent is going to do a misstep and maybe run into a tactical mistake. So try to set up as many threats as possibly can. Try to keep your pieces defended as well. That's just a good habit of getting into. Also try to avoid putting your knights on the side of the board. That's also another common mistake. There's exceptions to everything and every rule in chess, but when you're first starting out, you want to try and stick as much as possible to the rules. And once you get better, you can start to understand when to follow certain rules and when to break certain rules. So opponent plays the move right to e4. Okay, let's just attack the bishop with the rook. Now the bishop has to move back. I'm going to capture this pawn on b2 because it's undefended. Now whenever there's a bishop and knight, or it can be any two pieces which are in this sort of configuration, sometimes they can be forked, especially by pawns. So for example, if you play the move pawn to f6 and then pawn to g5 here, you could fork these two pieces if they don't move. Also, there's some ideas here of playing knight d4, knight e2, forking the king and bishop. So since white's pieces are all undefended here, there's a lot of tactics which they can run into. So you want to definitely keep an eye on your pieces, especially if they are undefended. Imagine if I ever get a rook to c4, then I would be x-raying this whole fourth rank and attacking all these pieces there. After the move knight to c5, white is attacking the pawn on b7. So I'm going to create a greater threat with the move pawn to f6. So sometimes when your opponent makes a threat by attacking something, you don't always have to immediately respond to that threat. Sometimes you can create a counter threat or a greater threat. And here the greater threat is to go pawn to g5 and win one of the pieces. Now if white falls into the trap of taking the pawn, then we can respond with the move pawn to g5. Okay, so our opponent spotted the threat, moved the bishop away. Okay, so we should respond to this threat by defending the pawn, but instead I'm going to go for some sort of checkmating threats on the back rank instead. So I'm actually just going to sacrifice this. Like I said, we're up a whole rook, so we can give back a little bit of material, especially if it's going to sort of allow us to win the game a little bit quicker perhaps. So if knight takes pawn, my idea is to, well, my initial idea is to go rook b8 and then bring the rook to the back rank. Now my idea is that after the knight moves, there's going to be a lot of checkmating threats on the back rank, which white has to deal with, especially with this bishop defending the h2 square. So there's not essentially any luft. Now, okay, white's just put the piece on pre, so we can't just take this knight. It's a completely free piece. Instead, I'm gonna again make a greater threat. Actually gonna put a trap. So I'm gonna play the move bishop to g4, putting the bishop on pre. Now if white captures the bishop, then we're going to bring the rook up to the b1 square and give checkmate. So we had that threat there, which white didn't spot. So now we're going to play the move rook to b1, and this is a back rank checkmate, because now white has to bring the bishop all the way back to c1, and then we can just capture the bishop. The king can't go to h2 because of the bishop here on e5, preventing that. Okay, so let's have a look at the start of this game. So we have the Pirc with the move d6 and knight f6, bishop to c4. Now, whenever your opponent plays bishop c4 against the Pirc, always be on the lookout for this tactic with the move knight takes e4, especially at lower levels or even intermediate level. This is a very common tactic. Now, when white recaptures, we play the move pawn to d5. Now in this position, white miscalculated because white should have just taken the pawn, and after the move bishop takes pawn, queen takes here, and then moving the knight away, he wouldn't be material down in this position, so this would have been a whole lot better. Instead, what he played in the game ended up much worse. So he could have also played the move bishop to d3. This would have been another line which would have been much more favorable. And after the move bishop to d3, let's say I capture, then bishop takes, and white maintains the bishop and also is able to keep the material. So in this case, I probably would have played either pawn to c5 or pawn to c6, and I would have developed my knight to d7 and maybe brought it out to f6 or c5 to attack this bishop on e4. And maybe I start pushing my pawns with e5 and f5 to gain some space in the center. So this is a common way to play for black. Instead, after the move knight to g5, I capture that bishop, pawn to d3. Now white didn't have to do this. White could have just played the move queen to e2 to attack this pawn, try to win it back. But pawn to d3, here it doesn't really make any sense to undouble black's pawns and also allow black to just exchange off when he's already material up. And again, with the move bishop to f4, there's really no need to allow black to exchange off another pair of pawns. Okay, maybe white has some ideas of opening the c line or the d line to attack this pawn, but it's at the cost of too much material. So after the move queen c2, bishop f5, again, here white should have responded to the threat by either 1, moving the piece, or 2, creating a greater threat. Unfortunately, there's no greater threat in this position which white can create. Rook d1 doesn't quite work because the queen is undefended, and unlike the white queen, the black queen is defended, so here I can just take it back with the rook and we're just a whole rook up, after which we can exchange off some material and be a whole rook up. So after that, it's fairly comfortable, and then from then on we just set up a threat. We can take the knight, but we go for this back rank idea, which is a very common tactic to get your opponents if they have no rooks left to defend. And here after move rook b1, yeah, we managed to get a nice checkmate. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I will see you all on the next game. Take care.